Welcome to this episode of the Good for America podcast. I am former Congressman Bob Good, former chairman of the House Freedom Caucus, and I will be your host once again today. I want to remind you to please subscribe to the podcast, rate the show, and share it with your friends, and follow me on social media at Rep Bob Good. Today's podcast, we're going to be talking about the recent IRS ruling about the 1954 Johnson Amendment. We're going to be talking about religious freedom and Christian engagement in the public square, in the political arena. This has always been an important and controversial issue in our country and our society. This so-called constitutional separation of church and state, which does not exist, as we'll talk a little more as we go along. And what is the appropriate role of religion, pastors, churches, and people of faith in government in our country today and in our country going forward? Again, this has always been an important issue, but it's never more important than it is today. I think we need the engagement, the involvement of pastors, churches, and Christians in the public square, in the political arena like never before. But it's interesting side note before we get into that. Why has it always been Christians who've been under attack for speaking their religious beliefs, for speaking their views, for influencing society, culture, politics, and government? Why don't we hear criticism of atheists, humanists, evolutionists? I mean, those are religions, essentially, the belief that man is the highest evolved entity, that there is no God, that there is no higher purpose, that we're not created beings, we're just accidents. Why don't you hear criticism of Marxists, communists, socialists? That's all the same thing, by the way. Of their involvement in politics and government in the public square, or about individuals involved with BLM, the Black Lives Matter movement, or the LGBT crowd, that they're radical activists, or the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, and so forth, or about Muslims being involved in politics and in government in the public square. It only seems to be Christians who get criticized for that. And I suspect it's because the world knows that Christianity is essential, foundational to who and what we are as a nation, what we are as a country, what we are as a government, like nothing else. But this issue recently came back to the forefront with the recent IRS ruling that the Trump administration, the Trump IRS, will not enforce the 1954 Johnson Amendment. They issued a ruling just recently that churches and religious organizations can engage in political speech and even endorse candidates in the context of their normal operations, in their normal process of informing and equipping their members, their constituents, those who belong to their organizations, that they are not prohibited from doing what every other American can do, which is to express their political beliefs, their support for a party or a candidate, and that they can do this, according to this recent ruling or a declaration from the IRS, without fear of consequence from the federal government, or specifically the IRS, with regard to tax exempt status. So all credit and praise for this to the Trump administration, to the Trump IRS, to my friend Billy Long, who is the now director of the IRS in the Trump administration, the former congressman from Missouri. I have to say, it's been a little disappointing that this new development has not been more widely, more prominently publicized and discussed and covered by the media and so forth, but it is monumental, if only for its historic recognition of what has always been the case, that the First Amendment makes it clear that the government has no authority over religion. The Johnson Amendment has been, always has been, is unconstitutional. The fact is the government has no constitutional authority over religion. The government has no legitimate role in regulating or supervising religion or what the church or the place of worship does. The government authority ends at the church door, certainly in terms of how the church conducts its business, its operations, its procedures. Again, the Johnson Amendment from 1954 was and is unconstitutional. Congress does have the ability to change the Constitution. The founders designed a mechanism to do that by getting a supermajority in Congress and supermajority of the state legislatures to support that. It's difficult by design. It's only happened, a very limited 27 times. There's been amendments to the Constitution. But if Congress in 1954, if then Majority Leader Senator Lyndon Baines Johnson, the future vice president, if they didn't like the First Amendment, then they could have changed it, or tried to change it anyway, by amending the Constitution. Instead, they just did a legislative amendment trying to say that churches, and people of faith, and pastors, and religious organizations did not have the same rights that other Americans had in expressing their political views, in their support of candidates. But Congress, again, cannot violate the Constitution. They can change it, but they can't violate it. The First Amendment protected the first right. The first right protected in the First Amendment was the freedom of religion. Almost everybody you ask about what was the first right protected in the First Amendment, whenever I've been at political events and speaking engagements and classrooms and academic settings, and I will ask, hey, what is the first specific right protected in the Constitution or in the Bill of Rights in the First Amendment? And almost everyone will say the freedom of speech. I've never, maybe one time, but never had someone answer with freedom of religion. I think, again, it's happened one time in all my years of doing that over the past 5 or 6 years. But almost everyone will say the right to free speech is the first right protected. But the right to the freedom of religion is the first right protected in the First Amendment. It says, government shall make no law establishing religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The founders recognized that the First Amendment was the reason why we needed all of the other rights. The right to freedom of religion was the reason why we needed free speech, free expressions, free assembly, that we needed to protect that right with the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms. And the freedom of religion is the most basic, most fundamental, most important right. What's more important to a person than their belief and their practice regarding their origin, how they got here, what their purpose is in life, what their final ultimate destination is, what is life after death, or what is eternity? Who is your creator? Why are you here? What is your purpose? That is the most basic, fundamental, most precious beliefs that the founders recognized and believed was an unalienable God-given right given to us by our Creator, and that we would be unique among the nations of the world in enumerating that right and protecting that as the first right in the very First Amendment of the Constitution, as they enumerated others in those first 10 amendments. So the First Amendment carries what's called the Establishment Clause, again, where James Madison, the author of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, primary architect of the Constitution, said a government shall make no law establishing religion or protecting the free exercise thereof. And that purpose or the meaning or the intent of the First Amendment has been misrepresented for decades now, more recently in the last 100 years or so, on what that meant. But in 1791, when James Madison wrote that First Amendment, in writing those words, his argument was simple. Congress has no authority over a citizen's religious beliefs, and no government body has any say about how anyone expresses their faith. That was written, that commentary on that, by Everett Piper in a great Washington Times commentary that I read back in May. Again, Everett Piper wrote in the Washington Times, in writing these words, Madison's argument was simple. Congress has no authority over a citizen's religious beliefs, and no governing body has any say about how anyone expresses their faith. In other words, Congress and the courts should leave the church alone and never presume to tell us what to believe, how to practice our religion, or how we can or cannot pass our faith onto our children. We saw this violated in modern times like no other time during COVID, where the government harassed and intimidated churches and places of worship and saying that under what conditions you could or couldn't hold worship services, under what conditions you could or couldn't gather together, assemble together, sing praise and worship songs, practice your faith. We saw that most basic fundamental right trampled upon by our government all across this country during the time of COVID. And so we know how dangerous it is for the government not to respect the First Amendment and to protect our religious freedoms. Um, Thomas Jefferson, the third president, is often held up as the one advocating for the mythical constitutional so-called separation of church and state to prohibit religion in the public square or influencing the government. That's how it's been represented by liberals, by leftists for decades now. But it was never intended or inferred in the Constitution or the Declaration. In fact, it was in 1802 that Thomas Jefferson, when he was the newly elected president, he wrote a letter to reassure, I should say, a small group of Christians in Danbury, Connecticut, that the government was obligated to stay out of their religious business. He wrote, "I contemplate with utmost reverence that the legislature should make no law respecting an establishment religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between the church and the state." But as this guy Everett Piper in the Washington Times wrote in the commentary that I was referencing, that the point of Jefferson's analogy was unmistakable, that there's a wall protecting the church from the state, and no elected official or government bureaucrat should presume to breach that barrier. So the Establishment Clause in the First Amendment was intended to protect the church and the believer, not to protect the government. And again, we saw how that was violated during COVID, and we saw the danger and the consequence of government harassing and intimidated people of faith and those trying to practice their religion. The First Amendment and the protection of our religious freedom is critically important to who and what we are as Americans. And any honest, accurate reading of our history and our founding documents reveals the deep faith of the founders. How many of the founders were pastors? Many of them were. How many of them were Christians? Most of the founders were Christians. How many of them were men of faith? All of them. Some, various degrees of Christianity, various sects of Christianity, I should say. Some were deists, but they were all men of faith. Most of them Christians, many of them pastors. These are the ones who the founders believed that the founding of our country, the establishment of our country, and the crafting of the Constitution was a miracle of the Creator, was a result of divine providence. They documented how they went to prayer and they sought God's help in establishing this country, establishing and crafting the founding document, the Constitution. They prayed fervently through that process, and they gave credit to divine providence for guiding them, for the Lord for guiding their path and guiding their steps. And this is critical to understanding the original intent of the First Amendment, the Establishment Clause, and the protection of our religious freedom. Again, the founders never intended to protect the government from religious influence, but they did intend to protect religion from the influence or control of the government. It was the founders and that first Congress who established the National Day of Prayer, the practice of setting aside a day each year as the National Day of Prayer. It was the first Congress and the founders who established the practice of opening Congress every day in prayer. And believe it or not, that still happens today. That happened during my 4 years in Washington. And thankfully, it was the pastors and the churches who were the sparks that ignited the fire of the American Revolution. It was the churches and the pastors who were the sparks that ignited the fire of the American Revolution. The principles spoken in the Declaration of the Independence were first expressed in the pulpits by the pastors. Later on, it would be the pastors and the churches who would help lead the fight to end slavery. They knew that the law was wrong, and it was wrong for anyone to be enslaved, on the basis of their race. And it was the pastors and the churches who helped pass the civil rights legislation, primarily with the help of Republicans, by the way, as they knew that the law was not being correctly applied and followed in terms of all of us being endowed by our Creator with unalienable rights, that we were all equal, and we had the God-given rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, all of us. It was the pastors and the churches who were on the front lines historically against abortion. and helped to influence the overturning of Roe v. Wade with the Dobbs decision most recently. And pastors and churches need to stay there today in that literal life and death issue. It was the pastors and churches who were, excuse me, on the front lines against homosexuality and standing up strong for biblical morality, biblical marriage, and the biblical family. And pastors and churches need to stay there or return there. Foolish are those who think that we can long retain the blessings of this republic without maintaining the biblical, moral, religious foundation upon which it was established. Say it again. Foolish are those who think we can long retain the blessings of this very republic without maintaining the biblical, moral, religious foundation upon which it was established. In fact, it was John Adams, the second president, who wrote that our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the governance of any other. And all religions are not equal, but all religions must be treated equal by the government. I believe, of course, in the sole truth of Christianity. I believe in the sole truth of what Jesus said in John 14:6. I am the way, the truth, the life. No man comes to the Father but by me. But again, all religions must be treated equal by the government. Even Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson himself, our third president, the oft referenced deist, rather than explicitly a Christian, he wrote, "No nation has ever existed or been governed without religion, nor can be. The Christian religion is the best religion that has been given to man, and I, as chief magistrate of this nation, am bound to give it sanction." So again, Thomas Jefferson, the deist, he said, I'll read it again, no nation has ever existed or been governed without religion, nor can be. The Christian religion is the best religion that has been given to man, and I, as chief magistrate of this nation, am bound to give it sanction. So Thomas Jefferson recognized that you couldn't have an effective government without religion. And he recognized that the Christian religion was the greatest gift from God given to man, and that as president, it was his job to protect that, to give it the freedom that it needed, to give it the ability that it needed to influence our government, influence our society, influence our culture. And before the Johnson Amendment, American churches governed and regulated themselves with respect to political speech and actions. But LBJ, he didn't like it when churches got involved against him politically. And so he sponsored, again, what became known as the Johnson Amendment in 1954, some 71 years ago, that prohibited explicit political speech in churches and by religious organizations and endorsements of political candidates. But the Johnson Amendment in 1954 was unconstitutional. It is unconstitutional. It's never been ultimately enforced. It's been threatened, but no church or religious organization has ever had their tax-exempt status stripped away for engaging in political speech, but they have had that threat for 71 years in terms of the IRS revoking their tax-exempt status. And it's had a chilling effect on pastors, churches, and believers. And by extension, it's had an impact on politics and elections in our country. Some churches have even rescinded or refused their tax-exempt status rather than risking consequence from the government, and they have refused to comply with the Johnson Amendment and said, hey, we're just going to rescind or refuse tax-exempt status rather than comply and surrender our free speech. Notoriously, though, liberal black churches have just flagrantly over the years ignored the Johnson Amendment. They have flaunted it with their souls to the polls practices, and they haven't suffered the threat of consequence like conservative churches have on the side of the right. But courageous congressional legislative action is now needed to codify the actions by the Trump administration. Once again, Congress needs to act to bring long-lasting benefit to the executive actions by the Trump administration, in this case, the actions by the IRS, and saying, hey, we're not going to enforce the Johnson Amendment because obviously the next Democrat administration could just begin to enforce it again. So the Johnson Amendment should be repealed by this Republican Congress. Why not have Speaker Mike Johnson lead the way, show some courage, show some leadership, and lead the way to repeal the Johnson Amendment, named after former President Johnson, at that time Senator Johnson. But meanwhile, pastors and churches should be reinvigorated in their commitment to being politically engaged, to speaking out on political issues and on political candidates, on elections, taking a stand. Pastors and churches shouldn't be loyal to party or personality or candidate blindly. However, they should speak truth. They should inform, educate, hold accountable, inform their parishioners, their members, their congregants, their attenders on the political issues, educate them on how the Bible applies to politics and applies to the issues of the day, hold accountable their elected officials, call them out, praise them when they're right, criticize them when they're wrong. Stats will show you that 30% of conservative evangelical Christian church members and attenders don't vote. Again, 30% of conservative evangelical Christian church members don't vote. And we're suffering a consequence to that effect from that in the polls, in the elections today. If pastors only talk about issues and don't include candidates or party positions for or against such issues, they fall short in their courage and their effectiveness. A church attender or a member who doesn't know that the Democrat Party is anti-God, anti-Christian, anti-Bible, a church member or attender who doesn't know that has an ignorant or a cowardly pastor who's not speaking the truth as it applies biblical principles to politics. We get the government we deserve, and it reflects us. I've spoken in some 150 churches over the past 5 or 6 years. By the way, my previous opponent, and who's my successor in Virginia's 5th District, I've heard him claim that he spoke in 300 churches in a year. Somebody should let him know there's only 52 weeks in a year, so I don't know how it'd be possible to speak in some 300 churches in a year. But I've spoken in about 150 churches in the last 5 or 6 years since first running for Congress. And I've seen and experienced pastors and churches all across the spectrum in terms of their willingness to engage in political issues and political matters. Some would ask me to speak and explicitly talk about issues and campaigns and elections. Some would even allow me to preach the sermon, a scripturally based, a biblically based sermon. Sometimes they'd want me to have a political God and country component to it. But sometimes when I would visit churches, the pastor was so afraid to even acknowledge that I was there or to recognize that their elected official was there, just scared to say, hey, we don't take any political positions. We don't talk about politics. We leave those issues out for people outside the church to decide. What an abdication of responsibility. We need courage in the pulpit and in the pews, not just in the House of Government. How often do we say, hey, we want courage in Congress. We want courage in the General Assembly. We want courage in Washington or Richmond. Well, what about in our churches, in our pulpits, in our pews, from our pastors and from our members of our churches speaking out? This is their role. This is our role in helping to keep the republic that we've been entrusted with. It's our role to encourage and pressure our pastors to take a stand politically, to take a stand on the moral, cultural issues of the day, to take a stand on what elected officials are doing or not doing who represent us, and to inform their congregants about candidates and about elections. And it's our responsibility to hold our elected officials accountable, and the pastors are preeminent in doing that. So thanks again for joining this latest edition of the Good for America podcast. I'm your host, former Congressman Bob Good. Please subscribe to the podcast, rate the show, share it with your friends, follow me on social media at Rep Bob Good. Let's keep the republic.